everyone. This is David Fournier. I'm the Chief Client Care Officer and Vice President at Adventist Risk Management. I just want to welcome you to this webinar presentation. Thank you for taking the time to spend on this topic, and I hope we have a good time here today together. Today's presentation is Safety and the Counselor, and this presentation is not short. I like to keep webinars right in that 20 to 30 minute range. This one's going to be a little bit longer than that. So I hope you're in for the long haul. I'm hoping we can wrap this up inside of an hour. But I hope you understand there's quite a bit of material here. Adventist Risk Management is asked to present this material fairly regularly at Pathfinder leadership training events. And so I really just wanted to get this out there for those who may not have been able to make it to one of those education opportunities. So thank you for being part of this. And I also thank you for the questions that you may ask as we go through. This webinar format that we're using has the opportunity for you to ask questions. There's a Q&A feature built in. So if you can find that feature, if you have some questions, we're going to do our best to answer those questions as we can. If you find that your question has not been answered, I do apologize. We are going to try to move through a lot of information as quickly as we can while covering it as much as possible. So if somehow we've missed you, I believe we have your contact name and email address from when you signed up, and we should be able to follow up with you if we are not able to get to your question exactly. I have a colleague who's helping navigate that. Elizabeth, you may see her there in the chat area. All right, one more thing before we get started. This is going to be the Safety and the Counselor presentation. I think it would be really helpful. It's certainly my plan that we build out another presentation in preparation for the big camporee at Oshkosh, the chosen camporee next year. And we'll look to do that webinar probably early 2019. And that's going to be very specifically about prepping for, getting ready for, travel to and from, and some of the risk management issues that we want to be aware of and in touch with going into the camporee, which is an amazing event. It's exciting, and there's been a lot of planning going into that event. It just keeps getting more dynamic and bigger every time. So we want that to go over very, very well. For the same reason that we want all of our events, our club meetings, our activities to go over well. We want them to move without accident, without incident, wherever possible. And that's why we're talking about safety. That's why we're talking about risk management, because risk management is really that idea of thinking ahead. So I really want to start off with a great big thank you to everyone who's participating here in the live webinar, and for those who listen to the recording in the future, because you're taking time, you're leading your club, you're leading in your conference, or whatever your relationship to the pathfindering clubs and those pathfinders. It matters a lot to me. This is one of those amazing ministries that our church does that touches so many lives, both our children inside of the church, as well as those who are not necessarily church members' kids. And what a powerful ministry it is. So I want to say thank you so much for making this a priority, for making those kids a priority, and just including safety and risk management as you care for kids, because that's what risk management is at the end of the day. It's about planning ahead to make sure that people are cared for, and that they leave an experience with the same positive perceptions and experiences as they went into it. Because sometimes if something goes wrong, it really can ruin a relationship, a reputation with the organization. We want to avoid that. We want these kids to come to our clubs, our churches, our activities, and meet Jesus and create positive relationships with the leaders and the fellow Pathfinders. So we need to protect that. All right, so let's dig into the meat of it. We're going to talk about a few topics, and today I've even thrown in um, an extra topic that we're going to get to just a little bit later. We're going to talk about some physical safety issues. Supervision certainly is at the one of the most critical areas when it comes to ensuring that your club is run safely. Health concerns, transportation issues are a really big concern here as well. We'll talk about that. Abuse prevention and intervention. Um, this is we're working with kids, and from Adventist Risk Management's files, we certainly have too many examples of abuse taking place either with volunteers who are serving in the Pathfinder area or between the young people themselves. So we want to be able to understand the issue, analyze it, and know where the holes may be in our plan, in what we're doing. So we're going to take a look at that. And also accident reporting and response. What do we do when something has happened so that it is addressed correctly and effectively? All right. You have a leadership role, and this is just sort of one of those notes that I like to remind everyone of before we get into some of the really detailed and practical stuff, is a little bit of perspective about how our church is organized, because it really matters when it comes to how we represent and lead, no matter what the ministry is inside of our church. In our church, we have a structure where our churches are part of a conference, and those conferences are part of a union, and those unions make up divisions and the whole world church. But it's very important to understand what that means. And I think, this works and is important on a number of levels. Because as we have, especially these young people entrusted into our care, we have a duty, right? When a parent drops off their kid and they've signed the forms and they okay, the kid is now under your care, custody, and control, their expectation is that the child will be returned to them in what's the term, the same or better condition than when they left them. So it's very important for us to understand that duty has legal, which I would say is sort of the baseline ramifications. It has ethical implications and moral implications. Okay, so as we represent our club as leaders, we need to understand that this is a significant responsibility we have. And I don't say this to make anyone nervous, but it is a significant responsibility. And it's important, I believe, to understand the nature of how that might play out in our particular church. Okay, so you really do represent something larger than yourself. If those under your care, under your direction, under your supervision are hurt, abused, whatever it may be, you need to remember that this is not simply a matter that impacts your club and you. You're part of a church. And the perception of the family that's been injured, because when we're talking about children, we're really talking about a whole family here. Their relationship with the church changes. And so we want to guard that relationship very carefully. But keep in mind that your church is not just on its own. It is part of a conference. And in our church structure, our church is organized such that our lowest legal entity that the church recognizes is the conference. So if you think of what organization is going to be sued or is responsible for what takes place in its area, it really isn't just an individual making these choices. It is you are representing the choices of that local church and really the whole conference. I don't say this to scare you, but I do want you to appreciate that it is a larger responsibility than many are really thinking about. And of course, we can take that a little bit further and say, you know, we're really representing the Seventh day Adventist Church as a whole, which is also true. And I like to take it all the way and say we're representing God our Father here on earth as well. So that should be the most important um, responsibility that we have. But it's important for us to think about this because many times we consider our role as similar to what the many of the other denominations in this country, um, in the Western world, how they're organized, where they may have really just standalone churches, and if they are sued or involved in some sort of dispute or problem, um, their insurance company is going to tender their limits. It may be, $3, $5 million, and um, maybe that's not enough, and the assets are awarded, and they have to sell their building. They go bankrupt. They go down this street and they start over. But in this case, we're talking about the Seventh day Adventist Church, which is organized by conference. And so think of all of the churches in your conference. Think, the state of Arizona, for example, all of the churches in the state of Arizona, plus the academy and the camp, and that's at the end of the day quite a large organization. And really, that is one of the reasons why it's so important to operate as a large organization. And when your Pathfinder leadership and youth leadership and children's ministries leadership, all of those various groups involved with young people have policies, directions, and guidelines at the conference level, it's really important for everyone to be on the same page and use those and follow those. Not to mention, it makes for successful pathfinding and great clubs. So let's keep moving forward. Let's look at risk management, the Ministry of Risk Management, which you are a partner in, from just a real quick theoretical model. We need to move through this quickly. But really, when we think about risk management, let's say our club is thinking about going rock climbing, okay? And that happens. I've heard of clubs wanting to do that. And so we're going to go through a risk management process. You're going to be a risk manager with me here real quick. And so the first thing you need to do is understand what the risks are involved with rock climbing, okay? Do we really appreciate what we're up against? So we just learned a little bit more about ourselves and our organization. That's an important piece of this risk identification. But now we're going to look and try to understand what are we up against for actually conducting this kind of an activity with the Pathfinders. And no, I'm definitely not recommending that you conduct that activity with your Pathfinders. But let's think through it as an example, because it's a little on the extreme end. It might illustrate well. So let's think. Okay, there's rock climbing, and then there's rock climbing, right? So what do we know about rock climbing? Well, I know that when I was in college, we would often go rock climbing, and we would just travel into the wilderness where we knew there was, bluffs, cliffs, large boulders, and we'd bring what equipment we had, and some of us knew more about that than others. And so that's one way about going about rock climbing. And then you're climbing the rocks. Maybe you're using routes that are already have the bolts secured, or maybe you're not. Maybe you're doing that yourself. Different types of risks, right? There's a lot of differences in the practices of doing rock climbing safely. Are you doing rappelling as well, or are we just doing bouldering? There's a lot that can be said for how that works out there in that kind of a setting. Okay, let's look at the very other end of the spectrum. There's rock climbing where you go to an indoor facility with a constructed rock climbing wall. All right, and so this is a facility that says that they have experts, they have the latest equipment, they um, are using, it's an indoor controlled facility, and arguably there may be emergency services very close by because this is in town. Okay, so as we kind of look at these two scenarios, we realize there is a huge difference in the risks associated with those two scenarios. If you take your club out into the middle of the wilderness and something terrible takes place out there, someone falls, hits their head, there's an equipment failure, how long is it going to be before the emergency services are able to respond? Are you going to have to, are you equipped to, help the individual in that location? So this is all just part of understanding what are we up against, and helps us make some choices, which we do in the next section, risk control, right? So now we're going to look at it and say, okay, well, between these two ideas, I don't think the out in the middle of nowhere option is a really great choice due to the type of organization I have, where if somebody has a permanent brain injury due to an accident out in the middle of nowhere, this is going to be a multi-million. In my experience, we're looking north of $20 million type of loss, which my organization is going to sustain, and the church's insurance is going to experience. You don't want that to take place. Reputationally, you don't want it to take place, and let's be honest, in the first place, we don't want that accident to happen at all, right? So we're going to control the circumstances. We're going to say, I'm going to use experts. I'm going to use an organization other than my own to conduct the activity from an expertise standpoint. They have to provide certified trainers. They have to be an insured organization. I'm going to make it their responsibility to do this and conduct this correctly within the ability of an agreement with my club or young people. Okay. Also, it's their responsibility to maintain excellent equipment, helmets, bolts, and ropes, harnesses. And of course, you're not going to minimize your responsibility to ensure that, in fact, that is what they're using, but you want to choose a very good, reputable organization to partner with if you're going to do that. Okay, but you're making choices that really minimize the opportunity for anything to go wrong at all. And if it goes wrong, there's better response in a more controlled environment. So now we move on to the next phase of risk management. And in our case, do we have insurance? Are we as an organization insured for this type of risk? Because I don't think I want, a child falling and having a neck injury or, a head injury or something like that, or even breaking a leg or a limb. I don't want that to happen. And if it does, I don't think we want to just take that out of our bottom line. It's better if that one's insured. Okay. So making sure with your conference that if I go out and do this kind of a thing, is that covered on our insurance policy? And if you're insured with the Seventh-day Adventist Church's program that is operated by Adventist Risk Management, it is not generally included on the insurance policy, but it can be obtained on a case-by-case basis. So definitely check with your club. And I'm not at all encouraging anyone to go down that road. I don't think it's a good idea, but it does make a pretty vivid illustration that we can apply to whatever our circumstance, whether we're just, booking a picnic in the park, or, you know, um, picking up trash on the side of the road, whatever it is. It's a thought process that we can use to navigate the choices we need to make as we go through um, thinking through the risk management ideas that we face. So let's keep going. I really feel as though risk management starts with communication, as so many things do, and setting expectations is is just really key to that. And that means both for staff, parents, students, Pathfinders themselves, uh, helping to understand, what are the expectations and guidelines in this club about personal relationships, the expected code of conduct, bullying. What is going to happen if those are violated, if somebody moves beyond the expected behaviors? Having those communicated effectively, kindly, but clearly ahead of time, and then sticking with that will help people understand what's going to happen and navigate, what usually becomes a fairly uncomfortable conversation in the aftermath of poor choices or behavior. But this is true for staff, parents, and I'd include the young people in that as well. Um, and you want all of your staff on the same page on those issues. Advanced risk management has an effective tool. I think this is one of um, our tools that is probably a little bit too hidden. I wish more people knew about it. I bring it up everywhere I go. I speak about it regularly. I would encourage you to download it for free from our website. Um, it is basically an activity planning checklist. It's a couple pages long. It asks a lot of questions. And this is not for you to send to us. This is just a tool for you to use to make sure that, many of us are really experienced with planning activities and events, um, and some are not. And so this is going to help kind of guide through what are the questions that I'm going to ask? What are the things I need to remind everyone about before we go out on this thing? It's do I have two adults in my vehicles to provide, somebody needs to drive and not be the supervisor. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Are we using seat belts? Is it, is that what is needed in this vehicle? How are we, coordinating all of our supervision staff? It asks a lot of questions that I think both the veteran and the novice does well to kind of go through, because sometimes when you do this a whole lot and you're very experienced at it, I've found that every once in a while something will get missed, not because it's not a priority to you, just you do it enough times, something gets missed every once in a while, and that can happen. So I think it's an effective tool. It helps ensure that all the right boxes get checked and the right things get said. And if you're following along with the chat feature on in our Zoom webinar system, Elizabeth has just posted a direct link to that form so that you can download that right there, right away. Let's talk about supervision and child protection. And this is going to be, we're going to kind of go through a lot of things in this area. But that really, if I was to pick one concept to talk about that I think the church can do it really well at and has an opportunity to protect our children even more and more effectively, it's in the area of effective qualified supervision. It's a very important topic. And this covers everything from health and just preventing those slips, trips, and falls, those simple things, all the way to bullying and abuse. These are all things that we grapple with, that I'm sorry to say we have experience with far too often. And I'll share some of the information uh, about that with you. Just in general, very important to have a key sense of the suitability of the activity to the age group. But there's when we talk about supervision, you know, children are different. And when I was working in my local church as working in the primary area, um, I really enjoyed that experience. I was teaching primaries for 3 years, I think. But I remember how different the kids were, you know, and whereas some kids, supervision ratio, you is pretty simple. You could really run the whole room with one or two people, and 30 kids, but one kid would throw that number off completely. I'm not recommending you run a room with 30 kids with two people, but just an example. We'll look at ratios here in a second. Um, as we think about ratios, I really hate this slide. Not the graphics. It's pretty. Um, I hate the idea of putting numbers on this because I find that whether we're talking about low risk activities, it says 1 staff to 25, but you don't want staff to be alone ever. Or with a mild risk, it says 1 to 12, or 1 to 4 for the higher risk. What I would really recommend is thinking and using judgment, because you've all met Johnny. Well, I don't know, we'll pick on Johnny, who you could have a 1 to 4 ratio, and that's never going to be enough to track what Johnny needs a 1 to 1. And Johnny can never be involved in a high risk activity because he's a high risk activity just on his own. So very important to think through this about who are my staff, what are their gifts, what are their abilities, and who's in my club. And if you have a Johnny in the club, these numbers don't make sense. So we throw them out there. People ask regularly, what's the right ratios? This is just a starting place to think through what is needed for your club. You may have further guidelines from your conference, or your local club may have some things already developed. I don't recommend ever having less than 2 adults in any situation. And I think it's just really important to bear in mind what is the activity and what is the capability of both the staff who are supervising and the students who are participating. Let's look at health history and training in this area. I understand that most conferences have a very well-developed process on this, so I'm not going to spend a great deal of time in this area, other than that it is important to have health record information. It's important for that to be respected as somebody's personal information. But keep in mind that they have released this to you on purpose for you to know. So I've heard of some who look at this and say, well, we have to lock this in somewhere that no one can find. And that is a bit counterproductive to what you're trying to achieve. Very important that the staff know if somebody has some sort of issue, challenge, health concern, what it is, and that this be factored in. If it's the kind of thing that we need certain resources for certain types of events, right? So if we're going to go outside and this child has some extreme allergy to bees, let's say, and needs to have an EpiPen, well, do they have an EpiPen? Does the person who can administer that know how? Are they there? I think we allow people to get away with quite a lot where parents are willing to send us their kids and say, carry on, it should be fine. Um, I've heard of too many examples of that, where the club has taken on a risk and ultimately have taken on the responsibility for something that they don't have the solution for, right? Um, so I encourage doing everything you possibly can. Uh, Having staff that are first aid certified, CPR, is a really positive thing, really important, really, really helpful. Whenever you can include medical professionals on your team, I think that's a win for the club, but not to be the, the typical risk management naysayer, but don't take on risks that you can't support. Um, I've heard of, was a case that one of our team members worked on some years ago, and I will never tell you details about cases such that you can identify the people involved. But there was a case where, there was an outing that involved, I believe it was a day, you know, out hiking or backpacking. It was at least a day out into the wilderness, and this is not just close to the road kind of idea. This is out into the wilderness. And there was one young person on that trip who needed certain type of medication, and that medication needed to be cooled. It needed to be kept in a refrigerator, and both the child and the parent insisted that the club you know include that child in that activity. And unfortunately, there are some situations you're just not prepared to provide the kind of service that the person's looking for. There was not a way in this case to bring refrigeration out to accommodate this request. And it's important to stand firm on that kind of thing, because in the event that that child had needed that that medication out in a remote place, um, you know, it just wasn't a reasonable thing to accommodate in that case. And unfortunately, they were all quite unhappy about that, but, happy to say that that person, because they did not participate, is still alive and well today. Um, and we've avoided a potentially really nasty scenario if something had gone wrong. So important to stay firm on some of those things, even if it means being a little bit unpopular at times. Permission and release forms. I hope that your club, through your conference, has a release form that has been approved, worked on with your conference. We are happy to recommend model release forms from Adventist Risk Management, but we coordinate those with the conference, because the conference's local legal counsel should review those to make sure that they meet the needs of the local jurisdictions where this might be used. When we think of permission and release forms, I think of three ideas that it's trying to achieve, right? It's trying to achieve the idea of a consent to participate. And I go back to a point I made earlier. This is basic communication. What does consent to participate mean? So when a parent signs off on a consent to participate, they're basically saying, oh, we're going swimming. Yes, my kid can swim. I'm okay with my kid going and doing swimming in this case. Again, I'm using a higher risk activity as an illustration. What that doesn't mean, though, is if the swimming trip gets canceled because of thunderstorms, that you can now switch to another activity that you haven't got their clearance on. We're going to go do rollerblading at the, or roller skating or something at the local rink. Well, they didn't sign off on that activity. They signed off on the swimming activity. Or, more importantly, does the parent think that their kid can actually do whatever it is that is being planned? What if their child doesn't swim? Well, maybe that's one they need to sit out. So important to have that communicated clearly and then stick with what it is you said you were doing. Um, this tends to fall apart a lot when we change our plans and the parents say, well, that's not what I thought was happening. Um, our court cases that involve that kind of a scenario don't tend to go very well at all for us. Emergency medical treatment authorization. This is just one of those basic ideas that says, if your child is having a medical emergency, please don't sue us for trying to help. And then contact information. Uh, who do we call? How do we who's going to be picking up the phone? You don't ever want to have to make that call or receive that call, but it's important to keep them in the loop if something has happened and get them uh, there as quickly as possible as well. So those are kind of the driving purposes of doing the permission and release forms. I'm aware of a situation, and this I chuckle because it's so terrible, where a club leader was actually signing off on the release forms for the parents, and just it really boggles my imagination as to why they thought that that was possible. But obviously the whole concept is to have the release from the parent so that they understand what's happening and how things will be handled if there's an emergency of some sort that comes up. So really important. It's a communication tool. The attorneys on our team tell me that release forms as a get out of jail free card are quickly dismissed. But that doesn't mean that they don't hold a high value as a communication tool that allows parents to know what they're getting into or not, or choosing not to get into. Okay. First aid, we've talked about that a little bit already. I just, encourage, and I may be a little bit overkill on first aid. I have a first aid kit in my car, in my office. I've got several of them in my home. I think that, being ready, you can't be too ready. So make sure also that, some of these items need to be replenished, restocked. Are they specific? Is there something we should bring along for one activity or another that's unique to an activity? Think through those things before you head out there. And then, of course, there's just the basics. It's barely, these are not even really first aid items. But if you're going out into, a hot area where it could be quite sunny or just high temperatures, do we have sunscreen? Do we have enough water? Being prepared in those ways goes a long way. It's amazing how the simple things are usually the most important ones. Common medical issues that I know our Pathfinder clubs have on their radar is really things like allergic reactions. People have those. It seems as though we have those in our lives more and more as years go on. Related to that, asthma attacks and diabetes. So having a sense of what those are, what those might look like, and appropriate responses and instructions from the parent about how to relate to those is really, really important as well. Other things you may be dealing with, I mentioned, the extreme heat, but you may be experiencing extreme cold, where you may be dealing with lightning issues. Uh, we all sit around campfires. It's probably my favorite part of camping is the food that happens around a campfire and the socialization. But where there's fire, you can get burned. So being prepared for that is really, really important as well. If an accident happens, um, really, really important. Again, I'm going to stress the communication part of it. But as a partner risk manager, I also want to encourage you to document even those incidences that don't result in, some sort of lawsuit or trip to the emergency room or uh, claim of some sort, that requires insurance or calling the parents. Um, we'll find out, somebody slipped, fell, what happened, what was going on here, or you're playing some sort of sports, and there's an injury. What happened in this case? Get a sense of being able to document the who, the where, the when, the how. Um, when we're indoors, are we experiencing the same type of injury? Are people slipping on the floor in the bathroom repeatedly? Well, that's a big clue that we really should do something about that area, or alert people to one issue or another. So it's a common sense kind of approach, but it's just about saying what's actually happening. Let's document this in a way that says, okay, if we're paying attention to this, what are we going to do about it next? Let's say an incident does take place at some point. If you're the type of organization that is communicating effectively, documenting that communication, if you're, you know, doing an active investigation into any, of these kinds of incidents where somebody is, injured, even minor injuries, it goes a long way to show that this was truly one of those accidents that was not very much the responsibility of the organization. That's again not a get out of jail free card, but it certainly um, helps the case a great deal when we engage in that proactive approach. So I encourage you to think along those lines. Things to avoid when an accident takes place. You may remember this kind of commentary from the back of your car insurance card back in the day when we printed those more often. Mine still, I printed out, and it has a little bulleted list similar to this one, basically saying, don't admit faults or whatever. You know what? That's important, not to admit fault that you may not fully know whether it's something that took place is the fault of the organization or not. But here's the approach I would ask you to take, and that is just, let's be like Christ. Let's focus on the person who's hurting and ensure that they get helped. Um, let's be that kind of church. Let's care for them. Do we need to get this person to an emergency room or a doctor? You don't have to make promises you can't keep, uh, but you can certainly show a generous hand of like Jesus did when he was here, where he just cared about what the person was going through, and that really matters. So um, while these are true things, I actually tend to err a little bit more on the side of caring for people goes a long way, and they can sense when we're more concerned about protecting ourselves and our organization than we are about the fact that they've been hurt. So that's my request and encouragement for you. All right, let's dive into transportation. Some of you may know where this conversation's headed. Do not use 15-passenger vans. There still are some of those out there. They are a risk the church continues to pay for some extremely high dollar losses that have taken place and taken the lives of multiple people in our church, young people involved as well, gravely injured in these incidents. They are not a good vehicle, even though they may be very convenient and inexpensive. They are not a good vehicle for our organization. So we'll look at the policy language that the church has pursued and has in place in just a moment. But just as critical as choosing excellent vehicles to use is using excellent drivers. And, there's some good advice in church policy as it tends to be, you know, effective guideline that basically says, somebody who's a trusted, good driver, good record, over the age of 21 and these kinds of things. And that's great. But I think we need to, again, use effective judgment even further than that and say, well, I've met, you know, I'm 40 years old. I've met 40-year-olds that I don't think I should trust with a um, a group of people in a vehicle, particularly maybe in a vehicle that they do not have experience driving. So we want to be very careful because vehicles are deadly weapons, and the consequences of mistakes can be very high indeed, very high. Important for volunteers to understand, if you're using volunteers to drive Pathfinders in their own vehicle, especially if it's not their own children, um, your conference probably has policy on this about what insurance limits they should have in place. Okay, so I don't know what each conference has in place for that, but definitely work with yours to find out what their expectation is. Because when it comes to auto insurance, the insurance follows the vehicle. So if they're in an accident, even though they're driving for the Pathfinder Club, it's their insurance that's going to respond. And I find that to be very appropriate. But they need to understand that that's what's happening, and they're not just going to, you know, walk away from their accident in their vehicle and say, well, the church should pay for this. That's not how that's going to work, and they may be very disappointed. You want to communicate that ahead of time. Vehicle maintenance, um, especially church-owned vehicles, I would say we sometimes struggle in this area because they're not used necessarily very frequently. So really important to be on that. Um, I've seen some amazingly bald tires. Really, really important to make sure that our vehicles transporting our young people, our members, are of the best quality and maintained in the best way. Supervision in the vehicle, I think I referenced this a little bit earlier. It should never be up to the driver to also be in charge of the supervision. Um, we have, I'll share with you a bit of information about abuse claims later, but we do have cases, unfortunately, really sad cases of people being abuse taking place in the back of a vehicle. And there definitely were adults, at least one, in the vehicle, possibly just the driver. Um, but that's the kind of opportunity that we need to um, really remove from the equation. That's a gray area, and we should know that that's a risk and not allow that to take place. Okay, I see some questions coming in, so I'm going to take a quick stop for those. If a rental place has 15 passenger vans, um, what about those? Well, I would say you would want to turn those down. You don't have to just take what they offer you. Um, I would recommend, and we'll look at church policy in just a second, and there are a number of other alternative options that I would encourage you to pursue. The next question is, same part of that, is a 15 passenger with a turtle top acceptable? Um, so what's acceptable, and you're on the right track, absolutely, is a 15 passenger bus, which looks remarkably like a van, but it has a reinforced structure, right? So the roof, the sides are not just these regular panel van style, and it has dual rear wheels. Okay, so yes, turtle top. The reason I avoid using turtle top now today as the terminology of what's a good vehicle is because there's a company called Turtle Top, and they do very good vans, but they also came up with a van that doesn't achieve all of those criteria. Um, so I was hoping for a really good recommendation and just saying, okay, anything by Turtle Top is good to go. But unfortunately, they do offer a van that is not. Um, I certainly can't recommend it based on church policy. Okay. All right. We'll look at that a little bit more on the next slide. Here's the policy, and this was voted, I think, in the fall of 2016 by uh, the Seventh-day Adventist Church here in North America in its executive session. So here's the new policy. It's really pretty blunt. They really went for it with this, and I'm excited about the approach that they've taken here. In the interest of safety, denominational organizations, that's you, shall not purchase, lease, rent, or use 15-passenger vans for sponsored activities under any circumstances. Alternatives to 15-passenger vans include minivans and SUVs, which I like a lot. I'm going to provide a little commentary here, because more people are actually familiar with the realities of driving those than 15-passenger vans. 15-passenger vans are risky for a large number of reasons, not the least of which is the fact that it is a different size, weight, length of vehicle. It brakes differently. It's a lot higher up than what most people are used to driving. I remember, years ago, this is not a good story, by the way, being in college, and I was old enough to drive things, I guess. And so they asked for an outing if I would drive one of the 15-passenger vans. Wow, we all lived, I'm happy to say, but what an incredible vehicle that I was in no way prepared to handle safely. Fortunately, nothing happened, and we all lived, but um, we didn't experience any emergency conditions either. So that's another piece of it. Okay, let's keep going here. Minivans and SUVs, mini school buses. You've seen those, and buses in general. But it's of course important that if you're using buses, that different states have different rules about what licensing is required for those different kinds of vehicles, and that you're using people who are not just great drivers, but are licensed correctly to drive those vehicles. And then the one I just referred to a moment ago, 15-passenger buses with dual rear wheels. Okay, so really clear directions from the church on this. And I hate to say this to you, but I've heard of some churches who take the approach of saying, well, we've got a church member who now owns a 15-passenger van, and he'll just let us borrow that when we need it. That does not work. That's not good for a number of reasons. Number one, it does not preserve the church from the liability at all. And it doesn't preserve that person who owns the vehicle from some very severe potential consequences if something were to happen, like what has happened to the church in the past. You have an accident with this vehicle, let's say 2-3 people are killed, as we've experienced, and then 3 more or so are gravely injured. And that person has that insured for local sort of regular car insurance type rates. Let's say they even have higher rates. Let's say they've put a $1 million, $2 million policy together for that. Well, they unfortunately they're going to blow through that pretty quickly. The insurance company is going to offer their, after much arguing, is going to offer their million, 2 million, 3 million, and they're going to walk away from the table. That person's personal assets come on the line, and the lawsuit still goes after the Seventh-day Adventist Church, because this is a non-owned vehicle, but it was our event, our activity. We were in charge of choosing how our people were going to be transported, and we'll still get sued and probably pay more than the owner did in this case. So really encourage you to take it pretty seriously that we don't want to use these things under any circumstances at all. I think I've answered all the questions I've seen. Yeah, I think we're up to speed there. If I'm wrong, I'm sure Elizabeth will get me back on the straight and narrow. Okay, managing drivers. I guess I've already talked about this a little bit. Just making sure that people actually are qualified to drive the vehicle that is being used, that these people have really good track record and are just reliable people to do this, because you really want the very best for our kids. Make sure that you're getting um, the driving record on anybody that's driving for your organization as well. Many of the conferences I know are doing that through the same verified volunteers process. Some may be doing it some different ways as well. So not everyone's doing it exactly the same way, but whatever it is that you're doing, I encourage you to do that. Plan to manage fatigue. I'm thinking a little bit ahead here. If you're doing long distance trips like up to Oshkosh, maybe that's 8 hours away, you really need to plan for what you're up against there, and make sure people are not driving for too many hours in a row, and that they're keeping each other awake, that people are, rotating through, and you don't have serious distractions like cell phones. Um, you've got somebody taking care of the supervision and all the chaos in the back seats with the young people, keeping them organized and generally safe. Um, you want the driver to be focused on driving most of all. Okay. All right. We encourage really strong vehicle maintenance. I talked about this a little bit, but really, I think the key is to document and also just get on an actual schedule. Um, you as a Pathfinder leader may not think that the vehicles that your church owns or uses are really your responsibility, but I would encourage you to expand your tent and look at it from the standpoint of, if you're going to be carrying your young people in those vehicles, you want to know that these vehicles are maintained on a schedule, that all the documentation is in place and is being done effectively. You want to know before you get on the road that your tires may need some work, and you want to solve that before it's too late. I've heard some pretty amazing stories of incidents taking place out on the roads. I heard one about a bus that shut down a major bridge in New York City because they discovered far too late that they had some serious issues with the vehicle because they hadn't done a pre-trip inspection of the vehicle. Better to do that ahead of time. We again have resources that just provide a checklist for you to say, okay, what am I looking at? What am I looking for? And I can document that I did that. Because if you're doing all of these things, it certainly presents a different type of risk and a view. If something does somehow still manage to go wrong, that you did everything you possibly could to run a tight organization. Okay, so I think that's a really good resource for you. I know somewhere Elizabeth is scrambling to get the link in there on that one as well, but it's a vehicle pre-trip inspection form, and I would use it again after the trip as well, because if there are new issues that have come up because of things that happened during the trip, you've put miles on there, something may be coming due, lights might have come on that require maintenance. Okay, well, let's document that and let's make sure that the right people are doing something about that. Okay. Okay. Wow, I'm getting hoarse a little bit. We're going to move into a whole new topic next. And let me just grab a quick drink of water here. Why is Adventist risk management talking about bullying? And I think this is a really critical topic. It's become certainly higher on everyone's radar in our society today. but I think this is critical as well. We're going to talk about bullying for a little bit and what it is and how it works and what we can do to identify it and be prepared for it and do something about it. But what it then leads into the next presentation, which gets into more the abuse area. So forgive me if I go through this more quickly than the material deserves, but we are already a little over time. And we are going to do this presentation on bullying in full um, next, I think it's either next week or it's coming up soon. So if you want to dig into this one a little bit more, um, please rejoin us for that. I'm going to go through it pretty quickly and talk about what bullying has to do with some of the um, more escalated issues like abuse. So bullying has three key components. Really unwanted aggressive behavior, right? A real or perceived power imbalance and repetition, right? It's not just a random incident, and then potential to be repeated over time. Okay. Types of bullying: verbal, physical, relational, cyberbullying. You can already see, I think, through some of these terms that there is a strong connection between bullying and what becomes abuse later or when it becomes escalated. So this is why I'm very interested in the concept of understanding bullying, because I think an organization that allows bullying to take place has created a culture, a breeding ground for the permission to also engage in abusive behaviors as well. Okay. Because you look at this and verbal, um, physical, relational, cyberbullying, these are the same issues that become abusive categories later on. Why do kids bully? Well, we could probably do the entire presentation on that, but it starts fairly young with children as early as 2, 4. They start doing. Kids will always test, right? Um, I'm sure you know that. I have a child, and yeah, you create good behaviors. You create a strong discipline in the home or in the club or whatever the case may be. But they're going to continue to test because they continue to develop. Well, what unfortunately can happen is a child, either through observing bullying behaviors or through just their own exploration and testing, discovers that there may be some success involved by engaging in bullying behaviors. So uh, early in the classroom, they may be engaged in protect, this is my toy, or taking a toy from someone else, really early developmental stuff. And, oh, hey, maybe it works, and no one says anything. And then other kids may be observing this as well and saying, oh, this is working out for them. And I like that guy. And I want to be like that guy. And I want a toy too. I want that truck. So they're going to engage in that as well. So it starts often very, very early. And it happens a little bit differently for boys as it does for girls. Boys tend to be a little bit more physical, aggressive, and that kind of thing. Girls, it's a little harder to see. It tends to be a bit more social in nature, verbal in nature. Um, but those are the things that we can look out for in our groups. Um, and for Pathfinder age kids, they may already have a pretty full-fledged case of bullying going on. Uh, whether it's um, the person doing the bullying or somebody who is just got in a relationship where they're being bullied in your church community. There really aren't any criteria of what type of person does this. They can be anybody at all, age, grade, gender, anything. Um, the person who is bullied, it could be anyone at all. But often there's a weakness or a perceived weakness. Um, They may have some way in which they can be identified as different from a group. Um, and what you can already tell that the way that boys and girls relate to those things is going to be different. So for the boys it'll be a bit more aggressive and physical. The girls, it might be just excluding them from participation in the social circles. So any perceived difference can become a real opportunity for bullying. I've talked a little bit about the differences between the ways that boys and girls conduct themselves in this area. Long-term effects of being bullied, well, I've been hinting at it a little bit already, but it can turn into serious things. You see some of them here, but certainly some of what can result is catastrophic to somebody's future. Depression, eating disorders, suicide, teen pregnancies. We want these kids to be affirmed and to grow positively in our communities. So we want these kinds of effects are really work against that, right? So we want to battle these things with everything we can possibly muster. Really important. Chronic, there's some long-term effects for the bully as well. Um, they become people who abuse people in many cases. And that can mean, violence, spousal, intimate partner violence. It can mean abuse, of a young person or a vulnerable person of any kind, whether it's an elderly person or, children, whoever it is. And it's hard to be, from my perspective, where we deal with so many of these cases, again, where Adventist risk management gets cases where the church is being sued because somebody in the church abused someone else. It's hard for me to be very sympathetic to the person who does the abusing. In fact, I'd say that's an area that I don't have a lot of sympathy at all. But this is also a child of God, and they are also clearly in a great deal of pain, and this is not a good place for them to be either. We don't want them, somebody who was just a bully uh, as a Pathfinder to become somebody whose life is permanently ruined because of these behaviors growing and flowering into full-on damaging um, abusive behaviors. Okay, this is really important stuff because it then turns into um, the real damage of full-on abuse. The bystander. So here, it's interesting to think about, okay, there's the person who's the bully, there's the person who's being bullied. And, in our context, we're also thinking about their families, right? Because when we're talking about children, we're not talking about an individual, we're talking about that individual and their family are often greatly impacted by whatever might happen. But there's not just the two families involved. There's the staff. There's the bystanders. And what are they observing? What are they hearing? And what does this mean to them? Does it mean that bullying is okay? That abuse is okay? What are the signals they're receiving? Because sometimes what they perceive in a scenario is, okay, well, this is the winner. I want to be more like the winner. It creates a culture where that's acceptable behavior. But for those few bystanders who stand up and make a difference, who stop the cycle, who engage the adult, who understands and recognizes that this is not good behavior, they actually can make a profound difference, not just for the person who's being bullied, but for the bully and for the entire little community, the group as a whole. So very important to um, talk about, what do you do when you see and engage with this kind of behavior? Who do you talk to? What do you do? It's important for our clubs to know how to relate when they see behaviors like this that are inappropriate. So, I think at this point, why does bullying prevention matter? Well, I think that's everything. Um, Bullying is incredibly damaging. So, getting a handle on preventing this as early as possible, staying on top of it, keeping in mind kids will continue to test as they grow and develop, but staying on top of it is so key for their sake and for the group's sake. Promote a strong, clear anti-bullying policy in your clubs. Um, have a clear action plan. Who needs to be told? What do we do? What are the consequences? And then stick to the plan. Need to understand what bullying is, and I'm not just saying you need to understand. The group, both the staff, the parents, the Pathfinders need to understand what it is, what the club's stance is, and what will be happening. You know, are you equipped to, provide or reference, outside counseling for this kind of thing? Are we going to have a little meeting, between the parties, where things are cleared up? Uh, what can you do as far as creating positive behaviors, and what's the ultimate consequences if those positive behaviors are not adopted for somebody who's engaged in bullying? Um, you see here sort of a cool graphic, and it just references really the cycle of prevention. Identify is just familiarizing yourself with what the bullying behaviors might be that may be taking place inside the club already. Stop bullying immediately when you identify it. And this is something I think that everyone, you as a leader, the other staff, the students can also help with and understand these simple ideas. Mediate, separate the students involved and set a time that right away. I don't think this can wait, not weeks anyway. I think better to do it the same day. And then speak one-on-one with each of them, and make it more clear. Listen, certainly. Alert, document the incident. I have been drumming on that idea a little bit much today, but that's really important. Document the incident and then alert parents, and the does the pastor need to know, the head elder, whoever is engaged with this at your church, and educate. What are the tools that they need to move past these kinds of behaviors? I'll quickly reference some scriptures here. You're familiar with these. Matthew 18:15-17. It really provides a model of what do we do. And it then also says, at some point, if we can't get where we're going, if we can't reconcile, if we can't move forward in a positive way, then we need to move apart, for the safety of those involved. Okay. Further resources, stopbullying.gov. October is actually National Bullying Prevention Month, so a lot of great resources going on right now. I believe we have a bullying video, which you're welcome to use on our website. Actually, it's on our YouTube channel, so if you just search in YouTube for Adventist Risk Management, we should pop up there with a whole lot of videos. You're welcome to use what we have there. So then, the next step in this whole conversation becomes abuse prevention and intervention. I want to share with you just briefly a loss analysis we did this year. So this is a 10-year loss analysis for those organizations that are with Adventist Risk Management, the church's insurance program, which is overwhelmingly most of the conferences here in North America. We provide the coverage for this. So we see cases, and this is a record of those. So over the last 10 years, we've paid just under $11 million on abuse cases, and this is sexual misconduct for the most part. That's 168 cases, 35 of which are still open. So I would expect that $11 million to nudge up just a bit more until they're all closed. Keep in mind that there's always cases open, but for that snapshot of that period, that's what we're looking at. Okay. And it's just numbers. Those are dollars, and I work for an insurance company, so dollars mean a lot to me. But I have to look at those numbers and those dollars and say that's not just dollars and numbers, but those are actual individuals whose lives have very likely been impacted negatively, permanently, for the most part. Very difficult circumstances and issues when these abusive scenarios take place. So if we expand that out, 20 million has been spent over the last 30 years. I mentioned the last 10 years, there's been 168 cases, and these can range, from some minor type cases that are less, serious, to some very I mean, I'll just say it, very disgusting types of things that have happened. And these can have happened between, where a pastor is involved, a teacher's involved, Pathfinder leaders certainly have been involved, other volunteers working with our young people, as well as, unfortunately, a fairly significant group of child-on-child activities that are abusive in nature. And what's interesting is we've built a lot of protections for our kids, and the one that we think of as sort of our go-to place to think about abuse is that it's the weird person from outside that we don't know, and a lot of our protections are actually really oriented to protect our kids from that. And in fact, talking to our attorneys and looking through the files, we were able to identify only 2 cases of strangers trying to abduct or molest our kids, which we certainly don't want to have happen. But, as we look at some of what our plans are as a church of how we protect our kids, that isn't the problem we're struggling with. The problem we struggle with is those people who are already inside our community. And what do we do about that? So these are some of what the church does. And I'm sure you're familiar with this as a Pathfinder leader already. The 6-month rule, the idea that, you want to get to know new people coming into your church before entrusting them with direct supervisory leadership opportunities with young people. You want to get a sense that these people are on board, that they follow the rules, that they are supportive of the rules, and that they're who they say they are. The criminal background checks, verified volunteers doing the background checks and the training. I know there's a few conferences that are still working with other providers for that kind of thing. So I know you're out there, and I think it will be best when everyone's on the same page on that, but we're working forwards towards that. The training is really, really important as well. Prompt reporting and discipline. I think this is an area we need to grow in. Referencing another part of our church's working policy, the 2 adult rule, making sure that, we're always above reproach, because there's always other people. We're never alone where there's an opportunity to be accused of anything, because it couldn't have happened. Learning appropriate touch and child discipline, making sure that there's great windows wherever we're working with kids so that we're never alone and private. Training and reporting, again, really, really important pieces. So when a Pathfinder tells you about abuse, I encourage you to believe them. Often the person who is abused has been targeted because they're not very believable. and either because they're somehow a marginalized person, they're just, well, abusers prey on the weak, and they know what they're doing. So statistically, what has been discovered in this area is that children rarely, and I mean rarely, lie about this. The younger they are, the less likely it is that they're lying. Once you get into the later teens and into adults, we learn how to use different types of power, and we may be lying at times. Again, I think we would do well to believe people, um, and at least take it very, very seriously and look into it. But the likelihood of a child lying about this is very low, for a number of reasons. It's very, very difficult for them to talk about this and bring this up. So if they did, the odds are that it's true. And they may have a hard time talking about it, and they may not tell you all of what's happening and who. Um, they may try to minimize the story to you, and they're afraid of consequences. They may have a sense of loyalty to the abuser. There's a lot of strange things that can be happening. So we have to be the adults in this circumstance and actually really be good at listening and effective at reporting and making sure that we don't just brush this stuff aside, and we need to take it seriously. Unfortunately, that probably means that ARM is going to have more insurance claims to pay out, but I think us learning to handle this more and more effectively is the right thing to do for moral reasons. And that's why we're here, is to make sure that we're able to navigate these unfortunate, sad circumstances that the church still experiences from time to time. Okay. When you're being told something, there's a few hints here as well. Again, I think really the key training you're going to need is going to come from going through the background training and screening and training with verified volunteers. But these are some your basic hints on how to navigate that uncomfortable moment. Don't overreact. You're going to probably feel more passionate about it than you might expect. But you need to be calm for the child's sake, and be reassuring. Don't make promises that you should not keep. Write down notes so that you can communicate this effectively in a report to the authorities. Okay. Here's a few hotlines and references of where you can find the right hotlines. Here's for Canada, cwrp.ca/help. Of course, working with your local law enforcement is probably a good first step anyway. For some states and provinces, there may even be more than one place that you need to report. So it's important to kind of look into this and find out what your requirements are in your area, and work with that carefully. If you're wondering, there's a really great resource, Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline, and you call them. They'll probably point you to, here's who you need to talk to in your state. That's kind of the service that they provide if you're not really clear of what you should do. What should we as a church do? I'll try to move through this quickly, but I think it starts with you. It starts with leaders. It starts with people who are willing to say, here's where we're going, people. This is what we're going to do. And we're going to do this. We're going to take it seriously. We're not going to compromise. We're not going to allow for gray areas and holes in our program. We're not going to make exceptions. We're going to do this, and we're going to do it right. Sometimes that's not a super popular thing to say, but it is the right thing to do. It's the right thing to say. I think the next thing is, I think we have, and you remember that slide I showed you just a few slides ago, where, the church's plan, our various policies kind of abbreviated there, the 6-month rule, the 2-adult rule, windows, and all that stuff. Those are really good. All of them are really, really important. But it's also important, that we understand which of those we may need to emphasize more than we have. Um, I bolded the one here, reference check thoroughly. The reference check is actually a really effective tool. You learn more through a reference check than a background criminal screening. So background criminal screening is really, really good and important, but the odds of somebody who actually has background incidents, convictions and whatnot, the odds of them, signing up to be a volunteer with children when they know that they're going to be background checked is fairly low, which is good. That's one of the reasons we do this. Um, but many people have never been caught. So many more have not been caught than have been caught. So a reference check is actually a real dialogue with real people asking, would you be comfortable with this person um, taking care of your children without you there? Does that person pause? Do they not know how to answer the question? Do they not really answer the question? Those are things you should take seriously. I have a presentation on this I'll be doing later, I think in December, um, about that. It's about building the right fence. It's how do we conduct reference checking and a number of other elements that really make us more effective of screening our volunteers that are already internal. They're already part of our church family, and they can. I think this is one of those areas that we may be doing to some degree here and there. I think it's certainly on the list of things we all say that we do. I think it needs to be done. Um, I think it's one of the most important things we do, and we need to take it pretty seriously. Number 3, effective supervision. We've talked about supervision already, but I think that's the key. Making sure that our supervisors are paying attention, that they're engaged, that people can't get into places that they shouldn't be. You always know where everyone is. You have people going to the bathroom. How long are they in there? What's going on in there? Bathrooms are one of those gray areas, right? A little harder to provide supervision when privacy is kind of the nature of the activity there. So how are we managing those things? And I wish I had super, quick and easy solutions, but it just takes us paying attention and knowing where those gray areas are and going after them pretty intentionally and saying, okay, I'm going to really pay attention to who's, going to the bathroom, how long are they gone, how many people are gone, um, that kind of thing is going to help us a lot. I'm sure that you're familiar with this verse. We use this one frequently when it comes to this topic, but I think it bears repeating. And whoever offends these little ones that believe in me, it's better for him that a millstone were hanged around his neck and he were cast into the sea. I don't think I can remember of Christ using stronger language than this on any other topic. And he could be pretty effective in his choice of words, but this is one of the more colorful that I found, and it's on protecting our kids. And so I think that says a lot about what it means to Jesus, and that should mean everything to our ministry. Further resources, I know Elizabeth's been posting the YouTube links, the links to resources. We have a whole section on Pathfinder safety in our website, adventistrisk.org. There's guides, forms, all of those things. I encourage you, it's all free. You don't have to have your insurance with Adventist Risk Management to make use of this. This is all free for you. So we encourage you to make use of it. We will continue to be building out specific resources for the Pathfinder community, leaders particularly, especially as we get ramped up for the Oshkosh Chosen Camporee next year. And I just really want to thank you for the leadership that you provide, the partnership that I have experienced working and talking to Pathfinder leaders everywhere. And, we have the best example and we have the most powerful book. And I just ask that we be mindful of the consequences of our actions and our inactions. There's a great quote from an attorney that we worked with on sex abuse cases, and his comment was that the church does really well when it acts like the church. And I think that's a powerful statement. Let's act exactly like who we say we are and who we follow, and it will make a great difference. I think we can make a difference in this area. I think we can continue to change our internal cultures to be more and more effective, to focus on all of the good that we bring to the table, and minimize some of these incidents that really detract and take away from what our ministry is all about. So thank you so much for your leadership and for what you're doing for our kids. And thank you for spending the time with us here today. We're going to close now, and we will catch you next time. Thank you so much for your participation.